Good morning. Welcome to ICUJP's Friday Forum for August 15, 2025. I'm Steve Rohde, the chair of this marvelous group. I'll introduce myself a little bit later. We're so grateful to have each one of you with us this morning, as well as those who are subsequently watching a recording of this program. ICUJP has been at this work for 24 years, founded in the wake of 9/11 by an ecumenical group convened by the Reverend George Regas of blessed memory. Indeed, all of our original founders are of blessed memory, including Rabbi Leonard Bierman and Dr. Meir Hatut. We were founded on the principle that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. Our motto and our mission has never been more relevant and urgent than it is today. So thanks for being here. We at ICUJP are grateful for donations in the notice that you got for today's meeting. There are a variety of ways to donate. We're a small, feisty group, but we do have regular expenses to keep the doors open and keep our work going. So please find a place among all the good causes that you support to make a donation to ICUJP. It allows us to put on these Friday forums, to organize direct action in the streets, to every year protest the continued abomination of Guantanamo Bay, to speak to legislators, and to really do the kind of peace and justice work we've done for these 24 years. We've had over 1,000 webinars on these Fridays with a few days off for holidays. So if you are moved by something you've heard today, if you've learned something, if you are motivated to take action, if you see that you are standing shoulder to shoulder with like-minded people, do consider supporting ICUJP. We'll turn now to what I always look forward to, which is a reflection from Rebecca Arvizu.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope I can bring you some upliftment in this reflection, because I've been really scattered all week. I have not been centered at all, hearing about the journalists, the 6 journalists that were who were murdered in Gaza by Israel, and I have not been able to even watch the news all week. I have not been able to watch Democracy Now! All week, and normally I'm looking forward to seeing Democracy Now! On Mondays after not having it over the weekend and having to tolerate mainstream media. I started to ask myself in meditation, why do I feel this way? Why am I feeling so strongly about this particular incident? There's been so many atrocities, and it took me back to, I started listening to old music and, from bands. I won't mention, who it is to cause some controversy, but there were some lyrics that actually triggered me. And one of the songs I was listening to was an anti-war song, and it said, bury your anger and bury your dead, or you will have nothing and no one. And then the next line is, because how does it go? For there's no point in screaming because you won't be heard. And it triggered for me at that point the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And that is when I realized why this particular incident was bothering me so much, because when Joe Biden had said in his campaign for president that one of his campaign promises was justice for Jamal Khashoggi and holding Saudi Arabia accountable for his murder and, the brutal, murder of him. He was a Washington Post journalist in the Turkish embassy. And then he didn't do that. And so that was a point where I said, I'm never going to vote for that guy again. And I just felt like it was such a betrayal by him. And I had my suspicions about him because of his collaboration in the past with segregationists, but that was just like, I felt like such a fool and so betrayed. And so anyway, this is why I think this was triggering me. So I looked today for a poem on Khashoggi's death, and I found one very short poem by Roy Bentley, who's a poet in Wisconsin. And I noticed that it was written during the 2020 campaign. And I'm like, so it kind of resonated with me. So this is what I want to read. It starts, poem for Khashoggi. Any given day, the world is woozy with evil. A forensic surgeon oversaw dismantling after. The accounts say killers wore noise-canceling headsets to mask the din the bone saw makes. Is it any wonder that we're left off praying for anything but our deliverance from such a place? In the absence of deity or justice, the dead have raptures of stars to rinse a dark earth in starlight. The dark scene foreshortened the first time I saw the northern lights. Emerald draperies broaden. Above the cries of coyotes on Wisconsin marshland, a light show rooted in its location above the planet. I knew where I had ended up when atmospheres flowed like runoff to the river and out to the sea. It isn't so much another man has died for a cause. It isn't even that a republic of coyotes is singing. It's that all of us must answer for how we spend the hour under the bright and ever-turning sky. On recordings that Turkish authorities, let's see, I'm sorry. It's going to be the end of this. It isn't the, oh, my phone is doing funny things. Okay. On recordings, the Turkish authorities release, there are first raised voices, then screams. So I don't want to end this on a dark note. Because it didn't end like that for me. I just felt like it was assigned to me. It was the same feelings, but as somebody told me here in this room, yeah, when it gets really dark and can't figure it out, but there's making some sense of it, that there's always hope. And to give Biden credit, he gave me hope there was going to be accountability. Didn't happen, but if I realized that in looking back on the situation, I was able to feel that sense of hope again and try to apply it now. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, as always. As we move directly into our program, Rick, if you can more fully introduce Omar.
Sure. We were introduced to Omar by Misha Jericho's project, Censored, which is doing some wonderful work, including, for a little while now, they have a publishing arm and Censored Press. And in September, Omar's book is going to be coming out. called Terms of Servitude. I put the link tree in the chat. The link to pre-order the book and to get some information is in there, as well as a few other links to writings that people have done, documentaries of previous presenters. It's worth taking a look. And also it has a donation link. So by all means, click that sometime. Omar has been doing a lot of great work. He's an organizer, writer, poet, journalist, and as he mentioned, he's an assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies in the Department of Race and Resist Study at San Francisco State University. And he's also a writer for Mondoweiss and the Electronic Intifada. And this is a very interesting topic because to me, it goes to the idea that he who controls the press controls thought. And that's been in various ways that quote has gone through history, whether it's Robespierre or Stalin or various ways. But the idea that you can change the dialogue about a specific topic depending on who gets to be the speaker of truth on that topic or perceived truth is very important. And I think more than anything else, it's come up in how we perceive Palestine in this era. And so Omar, if you please take it away, and everybody else, if you can go on mute, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Rick. No, that was perfect. I'm going to go ahead and share now, and I will just ask for verification that you all can see everything. So, thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you all today. And Rick, I also appreciate you giving a shout out to Misha, who's the reason that I'm here with you all. Misha is managing editor at Project Censored and the Censored Press, which is co-publishing my book coming out in September, along with Seven Stories Press. So I wanted to talk to you all today about what I'm exploring in the book as what I call digital settler colonialism. And I'm going to do that kind of by way of largely giving you some background of how the book came together. And we'll get a little bit more into that over the next few minutes. But part of the reason for doing that is, although right now, I think when we think about Palestine and big tech and the internet, we rightfully necessarily think of the genocide that's currently being inflicted upon Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, the book does very much go into that, but it actually began in a different moment a few years before. So I'm going to tell the larger story of the background of the book as a way of situating both how I relate to these concepts, how I think they connect to the Palestinian struggle. And I'm going to do that by way of looking at two different points in time where Palestinian oppression and resistance kind of started to gain more widespread notice. So the way that I have this set up is we'll start largely by talking about the background of the book. This will kind of be the bulk of the presentation. I'll get a little bit into what I'm calling digital settler colonialism, how I'm kind of intervening in the way that that term is used. I'll talk about resistance under this framework, and then I'll basically wrap up by talking about how I relate to some of the concepts today. And if there's time, I'll go into some poetry as well. So getting into the first part of the presentation. So this is the cover of the book that's forthcoming. As I mentioned, it's from the Censored Press in partnership with Seven Stories Press in September of this year. And I'll just say that, terms of servitude is a pun on the phrase terms of service, which some of you may know. And usually that kind of puts the conditions that we're forced to agree to use these supposedly free, prominent digital platforms to kind of put that term into conversation with what I understand to be the social and political inequalities that big tech companies work to reinforce and that they profit from, including, as the book emphasizes, the oppression of Palestinians. So when we're cornered into accepting terms of service of these platforms, it also reflects our own unspoken terms of servitude under capitalist and imperialist social context, in which companies that prioritize their bottom line above all else are able to maximize their own stranglehold and domination over public life and civic expression. So, I do go into more background, different aspects of tech repression, but as I'll discuss in more details in a few minutes, I wanted to particularly center social media suppression of Palestine. So in the book, I talk a lot about censorship on content, on platforms, like Facebook, Instagram, or now X, what used to be Twitter. And I do that because from the moment that I became aware of its frequency, I felt that this type of censorship is a unique form of censorship that targets Palestinians and their allies as they attempt to exert resistance in real time, crucial developments on the ground. And it developed out of 2 years or so, it's a little bit fuzzy, but just about 2 years, we'll say, of independent journalism about tech censorship of Palestine. And kind of just as a note here, I do talk about this occurring to Palestinians as a people, but sometimes I distinguish between what I think of as tech censorship of Palestinians, as a group, and censorship of Palestine. And in this case, I'm thinking of Palestine not just in the most literal sense, but as an anti-colonial ideal of a liberated homeland, and this idea of cultural connectivity, the attempt to erase that ideal from the digital sphere altogether. That's also what I'm looking at in the book. And so basically, my understanding of these concepts and how they apply to both Palestinian resistance and suppression really comes out of two pivotal but distinct flashpoints in the Palestinian struggle, right? And this is May 2021, which many of you here may recall, and that's the uprisings around the looming displacement of Palestinians in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, as well as the ongoing current genocide of Palestinians. And I'm going to say Gaza primarily, but of course, I'm aware, as I think many of us are, that this is also related to the pogroms and the kind of settler violence that's completely been unleashed and even further normalized in the West Bank, against the oppression of Palestinians in 48. So we're going to say Gaza primarily, but of course, it's all of Palestine that's facing this current horrific Holocaust. So now, I'm not going to necessarily do a full play-by-play of this, but again, just to repeat, some of you may be aware that in May 2021, Palestinians began to organize protests and different creative forms of dissent in opposition to this looming expulsion, settler expulsion from Sheikh Jarrah, an occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood. And many of these were families who had homes, that had originally been displaced in 1948. So this would have been at least a double displacement, if these expulsions had been allowed to take place. And these different forms of dissent culminated in a collective display and kind of an affirmation of broader Palestinian connectivity known as the Unity Intifada. And for those of you who recall the Dignity and Hope Manifesto, the activists at the forefront of the Unity Intifada, of course, were very clear about this. We are all one people wherever we are, whether we're Palestinian prisoners, whether we're in the diaspora, whether we're in the West Bank, whether we're in Gaza, all Palestinians are interconnected. And this is important because this is really kind of a historical return to the kind of rhetoric and framing that we had seen that characterized the birth of the modern Palestinian Liberation Movement in the 1960s, right? So it's significant because you see this recurring kind of at a broad scale for the first time, again, in several decades, right? But part of what distinguished the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings and the ensuing Unity Intifada was a savvy and intentional approach to legacy and digital media. And of course, it's important to also note that these uprisings followed on the heels of the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, right? Which meant that Palestinian resistance was increasingly platformed as part of a broader local and even global attention to the structural character of racism and white supremacy. And when I say that, it's really important to note that, of course, media attention is not interchangeable with material restitution. So more people talking about a topic doesn't suddenly mean that oppression is overturned. But, I think it is important that you have the sequence whereby you have the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings, the Unity Intifada, protests against the occupation forces incursion into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, following, the George Floyd uprisings, where more and more globally, we start to focus attention on the structural character of different forms of oppression. And the use of particular mediums to get messages of Palestinian defiance and resistance enabled a kind of complementary, what I think of as a kind of narrative friction, so that legacy media outlets, which I usually like to refer to as corporate media outlets to emphasize that they're corporate owned, but in this case, we'll say legacy, they become responsive to the discursive shifts happening on digital platforms and vice versa. So then, through this kind of savvy, intentional use of different forms of media, Palestinians, and their allies can kind of start to pit these two forms of media off against one another, so that you have a narrative breakthrough in one that necessitates an increasing platforming and a centering of messages on the other. And at the same time, these are generations of Palestinians that are very used to the conventions of different platforms. And so they're very attuned to how to manipulate their, I guess, the primary characteristics that define them as media to their own advantage to amplify their message most effectively. So I'm going to go ahead and play this clip, and this will be our first adventure in seeing whether the audio and the visuals are fully synced. And if they're not, I'll do a little bit of troubleshooting. And if it doesn't work out, because I'm a teacher, I'll just kind of walk you through what it is, and we'll kind of continue on with the presentation. But just to kind of set this up, some of you may recall this interview, but this is one of the first, I think, standout interviews from the Sheikh Jarrah moment, where you have the Palestinian writer and poet Muhammad al-Kurd, who is himself from Sheikh Jarrah, who wrote a wonderful collection of poetry based on his grandmother, Rifqa al-Kurd. And here he is talking to a reporter from CNN who's asking him about the protests that are taking place regarding Sheikh Jarrah. And we'll see his responses.
They're coming to finish what they started. Well, Mohammed Al-Kurd joins me now from Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you very much for joining us. You grew up in the neighborhood. Your family home is slated for eviction. What is the scene right now?
Well, I thank you so much for having me. To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law, it also implies the presence of a landlord. And certainly these Israeli settlers have not built our homes. They're not our landlords. They don't own our land. And thirdly, eviction does not imply the hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed police and army and settlers polluting, blowing up your doors, throwing your children from your windows, and using brute force to throw you out in the street and assaulting and arrest you should you resist. It doesn't imply the grenades. It doesn't imply the rubber-coated bullets. It's not an eviction. According to the UN and countless politicians and human rights organizations, it could amount to war crimes. Actually, the situation is pretty tense, I can tell you, and we're very scared of losing our homes to Israeli settler organizations.
These settlers and courts would argue that their claims to the land predates you and your family. Have you been allowed to prove otherwise?
No. The Israeli occupation courts take their documents without verification, without authentication or challenge, whereas our documents will not be looked at. They will not be taken into consideration. Besides, just because something is technically legal does not mean it's ethical or moral or historically just or accurate or correct. We've seen many, many systems exploit the law and exploit the judiciary to uphold supremacist and racist lives.
You've written very powerfully about being 11 and remembering this incident that I spoke about these settlers coming to your home and taking half of it. How does it feel to have grown up with what you've called the anxiety of dispossession?
It feels familiar because this is what every Palestinian feels like under the crushing fangs of Israeli colonialism in Palestine. My grandmother was thrown out of her home in 1948 in Haifa, and she was thrown out again in 1967, and again in 2009 when Israeli settler organizations colluding with the Israeli state took over half of our home. And this is my second time being dispossessed from my family, should they go ahead and do it to me. It's scary, but it also has a name. It's settler colonialism, and it's apartheid, and it's the fact that these settler organizations are working together with the state to exploit the law to dispossess Palestinians.
What would you like from the international community? There has been a response by many to the situation your family is in right now. What would you like to hear, especially from the new Biden administration?
Well, you know, I think the myths of self-defense and both sides are growing more and more penetrable. People are being able to see through these myths and call an occupation for what it is and call an aggressor for what it is. And this is what we're going under, what we're facing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, in Lid, is colonial violence. And it's only allowed because both the state and the settlers know they have impunity. The settlers are emboldened by an apartheid state that allows them to open carry in Palestinian neighborhoods. And the state is emboldened by an international community that refuses to call it out for what it is, that allows it to intentionally target civilian neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip and massacre 24 Palestinians, including 9 children, without facing any consequences. I don't expect much of the Biden administration, knowing that Ned Price refused to even condemn the killing of 9 Palestinian children tells me all I need to know. Obviously, I would like the international community to hold Israel accountable under international law, but I also hope free people of the world do their part to push their governments.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
Do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family?
I'm just asking if you support the protests that are taking place in support of your family.
I support popular protests taking place against ethnic cleansing, yes.
Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Mohammed Al-Kurd, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think many of you have probably seen, especially the shortened version of that clip that went viral, where that particular point where she asked, do you support the protests, the violent protests, right? And then he says, do you support the dispossession of me and my family? That especially went viral, but I wanted to kind of show the whole thing to show I think, again, the very savvy and kind of intentional way in which media, the rhetoric that we're familiar with seeing from corporate media, oftentimes these kind of sanitized, decontextualized frameworks, right? And being kind of refuted point by point. I think that's really important because that was something that we saw that really characterized dissent in this particular moment. And the intentionality with media as well as the cross-media coordination was really a part of that. And this was something that really became part of the broader cultural conversation.
In the chat, I put a link to the pre-order for the book from Project Censored and the Censored Press, and you can also get some more information on it as well.
Okay, so we're back. So again, kind of to continue this point of the cross-media coordination, you can see here a screenshot of an Instagram post that Hamad Al-Kurd did shortly following this interview, and this obviously got an excessive amount of views, but basically saying, from the outset, I knew it would be biased, I knew it would be inaccurate, but I made sure I course corrected. I'm happy you cannot edit a live interview because there's no way I could have spoken so bluntly about the myth of both sides and Israeli self-defense, right? So again, on the one hand, the way that the interview is navigated and the way that you see social media, digital media later being used to kind of affirm this and also amplify that even more, reflecting kind of the cross-media coordination that I think, characterize this moment. And I'm going to skip over this just because so we can get through things for the sake of time, and also because I'm going to be stuck again if I play it. But I'll also note this is another famous clip from this era, and some of you may know this as well. This is the Israeli settler confronting Mona El-Kurd, basically giving what became this famous line that people really just punned, into infinity, but where, Mona El-Kurd, who's Muhammad El-Kurd's twin sister, tells the settler Yaakov Fauci basically, you're stealing my house. He says, well, if I don't steal it, somebody else is going to steal it, right? And this became kind of an emblematic line reflecting sort of the broader structural character of Israeli settler colonialism. And what I want to kind of linger on this point for a moment to kind of reflect on how you never totally know exactly what's going to go viral and why. There's almost a kind of arbitrariness to it. But at the same time, when you have particular recordings of specific encounters spread, it's usually tied to these recordings' ability to break down the intricacies of power imbalances in ways that are immediately perceptible and obvious, right? So in the case of this clip, as Arij Sabah argues in Middle East Research and Information Project, you see something that perfectly encapsulates the arrogance and disparity of power that defines the relationship between indigenous Palestinians and Israeli Jewish settlers. So it's a potent vehicle for rendering the realities and the stakes of Zionist settler colonialism in digital terms. Somebody can watch that probably no more than 2 minutes or so, and you understand what colonialism looks like in its modern form. And kind of continuing on, just, this is by no means definitive, but here are some examples of different types of posts that you would see from this period. This is from Key 48 Return. And I forgot to mention, actually, as part of my background, but I used to be the education and advocacy coordinator for Eyewitness Palestine, which was a role that saw me training delegates to Palestine about racial justice and Palestinian political and cultural history. And so I remember seeing all of these just explode all across, different platforms, particularly Instagram in a specific way. And so, for example, you'd start to see things like this that really broke down the Palestinian struggle in very direct and accessible terms, but also making a point to debunk, these misconceptions, these strategically weaponized misconceptions. So, for example, this one, aren't they just fighting over religion? They're not fighting. Israelis are the oppressors. Palestinians are the oppressed. The situation is about anything but religion, right? It kind of continues on in this way. And I think maybe this is something that we'll probably recognize as being familiar to this moment as well, because where a lot of new initiates to the Palestinian struggle in light of the most recent genocide, start to become more prominent, you see more and more people also making posts like this, right? Where you start to break down what Palestine is, how it's about an imbalance of power, how it's not about, a centuries-old conflict or whatever else propagandistic renderings usually maintain. Now, this is an excerpt from a New York Times piece. I recognize the New York Times has been egregiously culpable in many ways in laundering genocide propaganda, but I'm sharing this just as kind of an affirmation that it was not only that people were using social media to bring about these narrative shifts, but that the narrative itself recognized, the importance of social media in bringing about these narrative shifts, right? So you see here, there's an emphasis in this article, which was by Vivian Yi and Monel Nagat, basically talking about how Palestinians seize control of the narrative from media outlets, they mean traditional media outlets, and using terms like colonization more commonly, more frequently. And then really, if you skip down a few lines to the next big highlighted portion, talking about how it was social media that allowed them to change the story, right? And then here, as though this is occurring for the first time, it's talking about how people took a red pencil to text from mainstream outlets. Of course, this is something we see that's even more common now, right? As you have headline after headline that justifies the genocide, or really omits any kind of blame. So Palestinians suddenly just die on their own. Nobody kills them, things like that. But all the way from 2021, you start to have journalists taking note of this and, identifying it as something new that's taking shape and identifying social media as an important vehicle for bringing about these shifts in consciousness that Palestinians are intentionally using. So social media is very consciously acknowledged as an important vehicle in establishing counter narratives to Palestine that, of course, have always existed, but now are also being increasingly platformed and seen by bigger and bigger audiences. But something else happens in this moment, right? So while Palestinians increasingly take to social media to document this looming settler dispossession and to talk about different forms of violence like the Al-Aqsa Mosque incursions, right? And then what would eventually become another bombing campaign of Gaza, um, you have the broader reality of Palestinian oppression as the byproduct of colonialism. All of a sudden, even as social media makes these new forms of awareness possible, the same platforms that initially hosted this content begin mass restricting this content, right? So, I mean, again, by no means exhaustive, but these are just different images taken from different media sources of, reflecting the different excessive and systematic forms of censorship that people who posted about Sheikh Jarrah started to experience, right? And then later on, as you start to see bombing campaigns in Gaza, the same restrictions also take shape later on other platforms also, including here you'll see what used to be Twitter, we now call X, right? So these things that became trending, hashtag save Sheikh Jarrah, hashtag Gaza under attack, right? All of a sudden become restricted. And people have their, posts deleted, they have their accounts suspended or even banned. And this happens at an increasingly collective scale, right? And so it's, it's definitely not the first time that you have social media censorship, but I think what made it unique was it was so blatantly systematic. It was impacting so many people that just as social media became part of the legacy media narrative as bringing about narrative change, all of a sudden it becomes something that legacy media has to talk about in terms of how much it's censoring, right? And so then, these companies are kind of called to account for it. And at the time they say, oh, it was a glitch. We're experiencing glitches. This is not intentional censorship. Of course, this is really one of the first, I think, prominent real-time enactments of corporate gaslighting that has become pretty routine from these companies, right? Now we're pretty used to not believing much of anything they say, right? And um, as somebody who, for journalism, has had to talk to these individuals and get statements, just as with politicians, you'll often get these very mealy-mouthed, non-committal things that don't actually say anything, and obfuscate blame, right? But in this case, this was relatively novel because it was happening at such a global scale. And so, as you see narrative shifts, you start to see intensive kind of systematic crackdowns for the first time. So basically, during this period, I wrote this article for Al Jazeera, and I talked about this extensive censorship of posts we're seeing regarding Sheikh Jarrah, regarding the occupation forces raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Um, I also talked about an incident some of you may remember, which is where the video conferencing platform Zoom, which really became kind of the default video conferencing platform that we educators had to use during the lockdown, right? They censored an open classroom from San Francisco State's Arab Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program, right, which was founded by Palestinian feminist scholar Rabab Abdul Hadi. Zoom in 2020 and then in April 2021 again censored a open classroom that the Ahmed Studies program was going to host on the platform that had featured Palestinian liberation icon Layla Khaled in conversation with other, heroes of resistance movements such as Seko Odinga and Ronnie Casseroles. Basically censored that class, prevented it from happening. And this was the first time, at least in this context, where you have a US class, right, that's taking place on Zoom, being actively censored by the platform. And this was in response to a massive Zionist outrage campaign, which used the, I believe now defunct Israeli app ActIL, which was an app some of you may be familiar with. It kind of, the way it worked was it asked its users to complete particular tasks, and the more tasks that you completed, you would get kind of virtual rewards for doing so. So this app was a key instrument in generating a massive campaign to reach out to Zoom to get them to cancel the class. Zoom capitulated twice. And so I talked about this incident as well as the different systematic forms of social media censorship we saw. And at the time, I referred to these forms of erasure as digital apartheid, right? And in this piece, which was the first time I really wrote about the topic, I built on the insights of Edward Said from his 1984 essay, Permission to Narrate, as well as writing by the Palestinian historian Mahan Assar, who made this point in 2020, October 2020, that, legacy media actually talks a lot about Palestinians, but just, without Palestinians themselves, right? So it speaks for them rather than allowing them to tell their stories. So, in this digital apartheid piece, I reflected on how over 30 years since Edward Said had said Palestinians are denied permission to narrate, this persists, but now we're also seeing that social media is stepping into the role of being the kind of arch censors that legacy media had previously been. And this is occurring at a moment when Palestinians had shown this incredible savvy and intentionality with how to use different forms of media to advance their messages of resistance, right? And I talk about this more in the book, but I initially thought that this would be a one-time piece and I would kind of move on to do other things. But what I found is that this censorship continued and became increasingly normalized. And so I found myself writing more and more pieces, right, that talked about, again, different, Palestinian content creators or supporters of the Palestinian struggle who were talking about Palestine in a particular way that found their content being restricted, being deleted, right? And I will say, like, initially, I found myself making a mistake that I think a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, I shouldn't try to exculpate myself, but sometimes as writers or as journalists, we can be very idealistic and we think, okay, if we talk about something, we're working to expose it, and eventually that thing is going to change. And that's not necessarily always the case, right? And it had just seemed very inevitable that this was unsustainable and that eventually not only would, this form of censorship be counteracted, but that because the narrative about Palestine was so blatant, was so undeniable, and keep in mind, we're still 2021, 2022 here, that this was it, essentially, right? That there would need to be some more substantial political change made. All of this kind of felt perceptible to me at the moment. And I realized, of course, that this was not the case, right? But kind of taking these sentiments, right, with me, doing some deep thinking, and then reflecting on other forms of scholarship, such as Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, right? Studies that talk about how big tech, for all of its promises, for all of its sloganeering, rather than counteracting systems of injustice and oppression, is actually normalizing them under new paradigms, right? And this includes systems of and structures of oppression, such as white supremacy, anti-Black racism, right? Then we started to see more and more studies that talked about how big tech is actually continuing old forms of oppression under newer guises, right? And so I thought of studies like this, like Benjamin's Race After Technology, and I thought, um, there should be something like this for the Palestinian context as well, right? Like I started to think about what would it mean to do a broader intervention about this topic and to particularly address this repression, this targeted censorship that Palestinians are facing, and name it for what I felt to be its reality, which is that it's a particular targeted and racialized form of repression against a group of people that is being facilitated willingly by companies that are willingly facilitating a decades old settler colonial project that is about expulsion, that is about elimination, that is about erasure. And so now you're seeing the digital extension of physical processes of elimination and erasure, right, which is the Zionist project. So, and part of the reason for thinking about this was also the realization that oftentimes when writers engage with the question of tech in Palestine, we're usually talking about the military application of technologies. And of course, this is very important, right? So I'm not saying this is a critique of people who do those projects, but it occurred to me that even as social media might seem something that's more inconsequential, in comparison to the more directly lethal forms of tech oppression, in fact, they work together, right? So that the social media censorship is a co-facilitator of the types of elimination that we start to see with more directly lethal forms of colonial applications of technology. And so I thought, even as I do in the book, go into different forms of tech repression beyond this, that it's really important to think about the uniqueness of this kind of mass censorship of Palestinians on social media platforms, right? And particularly because, as we've seen with legacy media, and as some of the reflections from the previous slides have noted, narrative erasure has been such a long-standing practice, of the Zionist project. So kind of get into this. The second flashpoint, obviously, is the current genocide, right? That we are still very much in the midst of, that is still ongoing. Um, and so I talk about this a bit more in the book, right? But initially I sent in a pitch for a book based on these reflections, based on these writings, and I wanted to talk about what I was thinking of as tech repression of Palestine, but also from this vantage point of, this is kind of a temporary predicament. There is change that is inevitable and it's just around the corner, right? I sent that in October 2022 to the Censored Press. And, after it was accepted, I worked on the manuscript for about a year, but then nearly a year. And then, as this latest genocide was unleashed by the Israeli state, I found myself initially unable to work on it, right? It's sort of, I think many people will relate to this, and I don't want to kind of belabor my own feelings because I think it's about much more than that. But there was this sense of, what is the point of doing another book at this moment? It feels kind of grotesque to do, to work on writing, to work on books when there's, a Holocaust happening in real time, right? And even as we've seen genocide, even as we've seen assaults at the scale, you have this sense that the colonial state is really trying to outdo itself in terms of its sadism, in terms of its brutality, right? In terms of its utter disregard for human life, right? And so you're seeing this kind of game of chicken with itself playing out through all of these different forms, of atrocities that are unleashed. And so with this, I thought, okay, I don't know if I can do this. I found this crisis of conscience. But then, I found a few things. One is that what we started to see or what we continue to see, I guess, in an escalated form with the assassination of Palestinian truth tellers, you start to see the real life and death stakes of censorship because people are really putting themselves on the line to document genocide in real time, right? Unsure if the message is going to reach the rest of the world, but certain that, the truth needs to get out there. And this kind of puts the stakes of, censorship, I think gives it a different emphasis and shows the importance of it. And secondly, what I started to see as well was that what we had seen with the Sheikh Jarrah moment, right, was that social was being routinized, right? So now the social media companies were kind of instantiating, instituting a process for what at first seemed like novel patterns of censorship. And so, we have two different phases, and part of this phase is that this censorship has become routine, has become normalized, and I felt that that was also something that's important to document so that we don't continue to kind of take it for granted, right? That we're so, not just that we're so censored on these platforms, but that they really were able to let themselves get away with it and turn what had been, this huge transgression, or at least in a narrative sense considered that, into kind of business as usual, right? Which I kind of build on the work of other, critical tech scholars and saying is a byproduct of the relative impunity with which they've been able to practice, right? They are not really able to be held to account in a lot of ways. And so for better or for worse, they really are able to do more or less whatever they want, because the idea is that if you use these platforms, these ostensibly free platforms, you have to agree to their rules. And this will include, censoring people who are trying to document genocide, who are trying to document colonization. They've turned this into a standard practice. So this was, I started to realize, a broader condition of a colonial status quo that also needed to be named, right? So this gets me into the digital settler colonialism portion, right? And so I'm not the first person to use that term, but what I wanted to do was to use it in a particular way. And that is to talk about what in the book I refer to as the confluence of US big tech corporate hegemony and Zionist settler colonialism, particularly by way of censorship. And that's basically a fancy way of saying that I wanted to capture the coming together of US big tech's bottom line, which often follows the trajectory of US imperialism, and Zionism's settler colonial imperatives, right? And to really get away from this notion that there's an inevitability to things working in this way, right? Instead, to kind of re-emphasize that the implementation of these policies that align with Israeli political interests is an act of choice. It's not inevitable, and it's about collusion that is collaboration rather than simply top-down control. So when I use that term, I really emphasize these aspects of, you know, corporate interests merging with settler colonial imperatives and the fact that this is collusion and this is a result of choice. It's not an inevitability. It's not something that's unchangeable. It's a result of concrete choices that are made that result in policies being put in place, right? And again, I do focus primarily on censorship, but I talk about other forms of digital repression. And so, for example, I'll go through a few here. I do talk about doxing, which some of you may know is the public exposure of personal information online so as to invite collective harassment, and blacklisting as key strategies of Zionist digital repression of Palestinians and their allies. And in chapter 2, I open with my experience, on this note of being added to, Canary Mission, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with. Some of you may be also on that as well. If so, we're in good company. But I open with kind of realizing that I was on that in 2015 and kind of talking about the evolution of blacklisting and doxing as kind of twin strategies, over the ensuing decade. I talk about trolling and digitally astroturfed propaganda or Hasbara, the creation of sites that kind of pretend to be organic spaces that will just suddenly start to drop Israel and Zionism, into their functionality. I talk about these things as key strategies of Israel's colonial warfare. And I talk about how these tactics, which were long ignored by the mainstream, have proliferated and become increasingly effective as support for Palestine is criminalized. Now, we're going to get back to this earlier point that was made about, having some expectations under Biden, then seeing that things immediately went south, right? So, of course, we can talk all we want about, the fascism of the current moment, right? The horrendous oppressiveness and racism of the Trump administration, the way that so many things are being, instrumentalized to institute a fascist status quo. I'm here for it. But let's also not forget that criminalization of Palestine in its current form under the genocide also began under Biden, right? So we're seeing a perpetuation and an escalation of criminalization, partly because the support for Israeli policies, for Israeli settler colonialism, is so entrenched in hegemonic US politics that both parties take it for granted. Now, we are seeing a lot of shifts on that, which is good. But I think part of what we saw in regards to criminalization is the result of this institutionalization and taking for granted that support for Israel is kind of an unquestioned pillar of US foreign policy. And both parties really ran with that, for several decades. And so, I talk about criminalization over the past few years, but I also look at how, particularly under Trump, in specific ways, we see what had previously been these strategies utilized by Zionists are gaining increasing kind of mainstream prominence, political mainstream prominence, I should say, under the current administration. So I mentioned a lot about about oppression. So now we can go into some aspects of what I consider in terms of resistance. Excuse me. So here, I argue that just as the narrative erasure of Palestine and Palestinians predates social media, so does Palestinian narrative resistance. And so from the birth of the modern Palestinian Liberation Movement in the 1960s, I argue in this book that Palestinians have always repurposed media platforms and technologies to advance a broader narrative of anti-colonial connectivity and resistance. So again, because it's going to cause some issues with the interface, I'm not going to play this clip, but I'm going to note it and encourage all of you here to watch it. And this is the famous interview between the Palestinian writer and revolutionary Ghassan Kanafani in a conversation with Richard Carleton from a clip of the Australian Broadcast Corporation. And again, you may be familiar with this clip, but this is where Kanafani really challenges a lot of the framings that are given for Palestine by Carleton, right? So there's a point where Carleton says, it seems the civil war has been quite fruitless. Kanafani says it's not a civil war. He says, well, whatever it is. And Kennedy says it's not whatever, because this is where the problem starts. Whatever you call it, then your questions will be justified, right? But it's a people fighting for their liberation and for their rights, right? And so the idea being that the ways in which you name, struggle, and turn defines the types of framings that start to characterize how it's addressed in a broader kind of collective public consciousness. So in this interview, not only is Kanafani challenging the ways that the Palestinian struggle is misrepresented, he's also kind of enacting in real time what it looks like to refute that phenomenon, and it's this deceptively simple strategy of giving the proper names to something, right? Refusing to let somebody else name your oppression and insisting on the names that as somebody fighting for liberation, reflect the truth of that paradigm and insisting upon that and refusing to let go of that label. So what I talk about, is that Palestinians have always been engaged in this type of narrative resistance vis-a-vis media platforms and cleverly repurposing media technologies, media outlets in order to advance a broader narrative of anti-colonial resistance and connectivity. So what we saw with Sheikh Jarrah reflected this in a particular contemporary form, but it was also a continuation of decades of Palestinian resistance, of different traditions and iterations of Palestinian media narrative resistance. And so this reflects an ongoing narrative that continues to be advanced and will continue to be advanced despite different forms of censorship, whether that's social media censorship now, new forms of censorship that will arise in the future. So, in my work, one thing I like to do is I like to really center or give people, the chance to speak. And I have a lot of emphasis on quotes, from the people that I interview, whether they're Palestinians or whether they're allies of the Palestinian struggle. So I just wanted to read a few of these quotes if we have some time. Here, I'll just, there's a few quotes that I would like to go through. I'll read this one by Asim al-Nabi. Many of you may know him as the spokesperson for the Gaza municipality. He's been on interviews with Electronic Intifada recently, and I encourage you to read his recent writings for that site, particularly his latest piece, The Story of the Last Date in Gaza, as he reflects on the Israel's implemented starvation of Palestinians. But part of what I do in chapter 8 of the book is I talk about how this ongoing narrative resistance was implemented painstakingly and meticulously by Palestinians. And particularly, I look at one part of this chapter, Palestinians in Gaza, and how they took to Twitter, which was Twitter at the time, to really advance these shifts in public perception about Israeli assaults upon Gaza, right? And so when I interviewed Asim al-Nabi in December 2024, he really made it clear that Palestinians, who were in the cohort of the late Gaza Palestinian intellectual professor and poet Rifat al-Arir, who was also assassinated by Israel, they really used tropes of narrative resistance to advance the Palestinian struggle and the oppression that Palestinians in Gaza face through sites like Twitter. And this happened over several years, right? And he talked about how they were aware of the strategies of these platforms or the conventions of these platforms and used narrative interventions in a very strategic way over time. And so when you talk about how there's so much awareness today, even as every truth teller, who takes to social media to document the genocide in real time, they are heroes. But at the same time, this is also the result of sustained resistance and dissent by Palestinians, with a savvy, intentional usage of these platforms. And so what he told me, is when you look today and you see the newfound awareness that's taking place, that we have to thank every guy, every girl who took out his or her phone in Gaza and who took photos, right? So meaning that it's been a huge collective effort over many, many years to kind of create what seems to be a more immediately perceptive newfound awareness, right? I'll go through some of these. I won't read these out, but I'll just note that another interviewee is Ramzi Baroud, co-founder of the Palestine Chronicle. I also talked to Laura Alborno, and one of the methodologies used obviously was interviewing people who face different forms of censorship and repression. And while I won't read it in full, Alborno's sentiment here is that, I'm facing a lot of censorship repression. She's faced a lot of shadow banning, the disappearing of posts, non-consensual deletion of followers. But at the same time, she says, despite all of this, I've seen people's consciousness change, and I've had people reach out to me and say, what you share has changed my perspective. I'm not a Zionist anymore because I found your page and I started reading what you were saying. And so for her, the takeaway is that, this repression is taking place precisely because these are such effective platforms. And so we don't want to be defeatist and say, that's it, we're going to surrender everything and stop trying to do this type of work, because we actually know how effective it can be. And the kind of silver lining to repression is that it's been so effective, and that's precisely why you see it unleashed in these new forms. And so I think we can close out there. I'll just say I also profile campaigns like No Tech for Apartheid, which came together to resist Project Nimbus. And I talk about the ways that you can see the colonial character of the Palestinian resistance struggle reflected in the disparate usage of social media that you see, for example, from the occupation forces and from resistance forces. So those are some different aspects of what resistance looks like when it's discussed in the book. So I think I'll close there, and I'll say what I think is a straightforward takeaway. It's up to all of us to continue to do whatever we can, wherever we are, to advance the cause of Palestinian freedom and liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Please take a deep breath. That was a tremendous amount of information. I'm so curious about your book, and I'm sure everybody else is. I'd like to kick off the questions myself. As people raise their hands, I'll get a measure of how many questions we've got going. So, in your book and in your research, did you find a systematic use of community standards to remove and erase largely I'll call it pro-Palestinian speech? And if so, what were the rationale? What community standard are such messages violating? And did you quantify this and measure it as against other forms of removal by the various big tech firms?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's a great point about methodology. I will say my methodology was not statistical quantification, but I relied a lot upon research, done by organizations such as Hamla, which many of you know is the Palestinian digital rights organization. I looked at their meticulous and painstaking. They actually did this work to talk about the percentages, and the disparate censorship that Palestinians, as opposed to other users, have faced for their posts. Um, of course, there's an egregiousness to this, in the context of the current genocide, but this had been ongoing, for well prior to that. So I really relied on the important research of organizations like Hamlet or spaces like Access Now for, let's say, the statistical breadth of this, as well as the Human Rights Watch reporting on Meta, which I would encourage people to read that Human Rights Watch report, Meta's Broken Promises, which I believe it was issued in December 2023, but it basically talked about how Meta had systematically censored and targeted Palestinian posts for several years. And of course, I think as organizers and activists, like we are here, we may be involved with different outfits, including, Jewish Voice for Peace and affiliate organizations, raised the alarm all the way in 2015 when you had Emmy Palmer, who was put on the oversight board of Facebook, right? Now, this was somebody who had headed up the cyber unit, which had really streamlined the process of criminalizing Palestinian social media posts and treating them as incitement. So definitely there was widespread targeting and deletion of Palestinian posts. Usually the reliance on community standards as a framework, it was common, but it was also vague, right? So that usually they would say things like, well, we delete posts that, violate our community standards. Usually there wasn't too much specificity gone into it, but you would get a list of things like support for terrorism. So a lot of people that I talked to had their posts deleted under so-called support for terrorism when they were simply, I'm not even going to get into what they were actually doing, because this almost kind of plays into the logic of, well, maybe because they weren't, right? They're just weaponizing things like support for terrorism as a broad swath to be able to censor as many things as possible. And so, yeah, definitely community standards and terms of service, the two kind of interconnected ways of censoring posts. I found that to be very widespread and actually increasingly instrumentalized.
Thank you. I'll hold back with some of my further questions. We've got about 20 minutes for this. So short questions, short answers. Let's start with Rick.
Yeah, Omar, thank you very much. That was very informative, and it I think it not only talks to the issue about Palestinian oppression in cyberspace, but a bigger there's maybe a bigger issue in there, in that progressives tend to shy away from using the tools of their own oppression, right? So, when it comes to pushing back on things like, uh, digital, uh, social media companies that are misinforming, in a way, we feel like we're sullying our hands if we type something to them, or push back on that narrative, or change the algorithm in some way by having a mass uh, protest of some sort, or pushback. And that's something that, for me anyway, as someone who came from social media and marketing, I find that's a very big divide to cross. And I'm wondering if one of the big ones that I've seen work is no tech for apartheid. And I'm wondering if you see any other examples of other organizations that are not only using that as a tactic, but actually getting people um, to get on board and fight back in that way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. There's a lot there, and I think one thing that stands out to me is that there's a tension. Maybe tension is not the right word, but let's say there's a bit of a contrast between some of what groups and individuals had recommended in terms of starting new platforms versus staying on these incredibly censorious ones, right? And part of the problem that I get into with the text is precisely that these are platforms that increasingly have such a dominant influence on all aspects of life, socially, vocationally, politically. They've really insinuated themselves in so many different places. And so when they become so tyrannical in their suppression, do have this attitude, and I think it's warranted in the sense that well, what are you going to do? You can't go anywhere else, right? Cory Doctorow talks about enshittification, right? So I found it interesting because some people said we need our own platforms because we've realized we're organizing, on public property. And if you're organizing on public property, people can pull the rug out from under you at any time. And I think they're right, but there's also another perspective that I found. So for example, when I talked to Sammy Doon, who, as you all know, is facing horrendous criminalization, but this is a systematic outgrowth of the different forms of political censorship, including digital censorship that they have faced over the years. And so I profiled them at several points, prior to the latest criminalization and after it. And what they had said, prior, but when they faced things like having their YouTube account completely deleted, they said, it's tricky because we do use other platforms like Odyssey. Now we're smarter about telling organizations, make sure you back up everything you have because a popular platform can take it away at any time, right? But you also need to meet people where they're at. And we recognize that the masses are going to be on Instagram rather than on Telegram, right? And so I think what I found is that people some have been completely outright banned from platforms, but everybody continues to organize in the way that they know best and to make interventions and continue to try to cleverly outwit censorship. So one way, which I think we see in more contemporary examples of social media now, for instance, is that people try to evade algorithms by using what they call algo speak, or they'll kind of I don't want to call it self-censorship, but they'll use different terms that are not as likely to be flagged. So I do think that there is a sentiment of let's leave these platforms, let's make something new. But there's also a lot of people who have stayed on them, and when I talk to organizations like Within Our Lifetime who face these bans, but continue to rely on in-person protests and word of mouth, or when I talk to Sammy Dune, who said that, we need to continue to meet people where they're at, what you see is that the dominant takeaway is that everybody's continuing to do what they can where they are, right? And recognizing that it takes a plurality of approaches and means, whether that's digital or whether that's, in real time.
Thank you. We do need to trim our time. So I'm going to use a device we've used before. It puts a little burden on you, Omar, to listen to two questions. They may overlap and you may streamline. A couple people have now taken down their hands. Thank you. If you can add further comments later. So I'll take Ipyani and then Dave, and then Omar, you can answer both those questions.
Definitely. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Brother Omar. My question is what are some strategies or approaches that we may be able to utilize to combat dehumanization and demonization of many of cultures and ethnicities around this world is a common tactic that they seem to use?
Good. Keep that in mind. And Dave Clennon.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for mentioning Cory Doctorow. I wanted to go back to your mentioning the use of terminology can play into the thought control process of the oppressor. And I'm thinking of the example of calling Hamas a terrorist group. And instead of saying it's an armed Palestinian resistance group, or saying the terrorist attack of October 7th, which could also be called a military operation in the service of the liberation of the people of Gaza. Are there any other examples that you could give of the way language and words, even individual words or phrases, are used to colonize our brains?
Two very good questions. Omar.
Yeah, thank you. And in a lot of ways, those work together very nicely. So, I mean, to me, lately, what I've been coming back to is the predicament of Palestinian dehumanization it's honestly premised on the question of resistance, right? And in particular, armed resistance. I understand that, we're a part of organizations that think of a plurality of means for resistance, but at the same time, I think one of the surest ways to combat dehumanization is to make sure that we're not holding Palestinians to a different standard that we wouldn't hold, any other collective group in human history to, so every anti-colonial struggle has utilized armed resistance as legitimate and rightful tactic. And so part of what we can do, I think, is to make sure that we're not even unconsciously kind of adopting these compromised frameworks of, quote unquote, terrorism or extremism when we're thinking about the Palestinian context, right? To a certain extent, the extent to which we humanize somebody is the extent to which we recognize the rightfulness of things like a right to resist militarily. And then secondly, I think it's also really questioning, to get to this question of terrorism, Craig Mukhiber has a really good point about this, which is that the US and, to a certain extent, Western powers broadly really want to weaponize terrorism in a very particular way, which is to kind of make it a type of political liquidation, whereby all of a sudden the terms of a cause are no longer engaged with in any form. There's no negotiation because this is a quote unquote terrorist cause or organization. And the reality is, even as we're looking at different types of struggle and resistance, that, logic, that framework, has no place in international law and the just resolution of different forms of oppression, precisely because, we need to recognize the full and total rights of people to resist their oppression. And we need to seriously think about, even as we may think about different forms we ourselves may use or support, the rights that all people have under unjust situations such as colonization. So that's one way for me to resist dehumanization. But I would also just say to be wary of the logics of so-called extremism or so-called, all of these things that are proximate to terrorism that we see weaponized, not just by Zionist organizations, but often liberal frameworks that really want Palestinians to be what Mohammed El-Kurd refers to as the perfect victims. We really need to make sure that we, as much as possible, challenge those within our own minds as well as our spaces.
Thank you for that. Please feel free to raise your hands if you do have other questions, either electronically or physically, if I can spot them.
And I'm still here really quickly. I'm just handing something over, so I'm off camera.
Oh, good. Okay. We know you haven't left us. But if you can hear me, talking about double standards, and I know your book was under research prior to Trump's reelection and then carrying into the early months of this year. But what are you seeing in the last 6 months under Trump 2.0 that equally speaks to the erasure of Palestinian voices? I understand that, and by the way, you may define canary for everyone. I don't know that everyone is familiar with that website and how it's been used and how recently it's been discovered that ICE and Homeland Security are consulting Canary to identify students and professors who are being targeted by the efforts to deport students who have expressed pro-Palestinian views and organized protests. So the essential question there is to share with us the nature of Canary and how now it has been promoted from just a website, a pro-Israeli website, into being weaponized through the Trump administration, and expand on that as you would like.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just want to note that actually the last stages of finalizing the manuscript were in many ways a struggle because of this, because all of these things that I had talked about that took place over several years were just being sped up, right? In just these on these ways that just like really outpaced me, right, in terms of what we're seeing under Trump. So Canary Mission, and I'm glad that some of us here have maybe the fortune of not being familiar with it, but it was this site that started around 2015 or so, but it was a site that really was a blacklist, right, of Palestinian supporters of Palestinian freedom and liberation, um, and of all kinds. And it was anonymously run, right? So, but basically, you would have people who supported Palestine who are put under this blacklist, who have oftentimes their employment information being listed with the intention being basically to incentivize large supporters of Israel to, call to pressure their, places of employment, to fire these people, to harass them. So really, it was just this anonymously run blacklist site that made sure that pro-Palestine individuals and groups were subject to harassment, loss of employment. They had this famous tagline in one of their videos that said, make sure that today's radicals do not become tomorrow's employees. And so, this had been in 2015, so it's been there for several years. Over time, people started to identify more and more of the funders. Of course, it's ultimately an Israeli project of cyber warfare. If you watch the film The Lobby, you'll see a frank discussion of this. And people, like from the Israel on Campus Coalition, I believe, have talked about how it's an intentional direct use of what they call cyber warfare, an attempt to really psychologically inflict harm upon individuals. But on the one hand, this was kind of one of those things that for many years was sort of considered just par for the course if you're doing this type of work, and generally ignored by employers, by institutions. So if you were subjected to this, you kind of had to suffer in silence, and it wasn't really legitimized in any way. Then meanwhile, you start to have newer blacklist sites arise, like stopantisemitism.org. But what we've started to see happen now is that, as was mentioned, this is being operationalized by the Trump administration, so that now all of these different aspects of Zionist cyber warfare, from the blacklisting to the doxing, are being increasingly legitimized by a Trump administration that is very clearly willing to allow for the criminalization of, Palestine, the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to kind of implement these things as part and parcel of a broader fascist politics, so that precisely people have started to be directly and explicitly targeted for their Palestine organizing, for their being blacklisted on sites like Canary Mission, through institutions like ICE, right? And this has been explicitly named. Marco Rubio mentioned that they were doing this catch and revoke program, which uses AI basically to scrape the social media, of visa applicants to make sure they don't have what they consider quote unquote pro-Hamas sympathies. So very clearly what had been this, I would say this intense, yet to a certain extent, limited aspect of repression, limited meaning that you would encounter it as an organizer, is now being legitimized by the current administration and explicitly used as one of their means of targeting, vulnerable individuals and communities. And it's to the extent that organizations like the far right fringe organization Beitar USA, they've said, we are collaborating with the Trump administration. We provide lists of names that they should deport. You see increasingly people on X tagging Marco Rubio whenever they see a pro-Palestine post they don't like, look into this person. So definitely, it's something that is being increasingly normalized under this unjust regime at this point in time. But it's been there for many, many years.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. I have one final question, but Dave, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk about, in terms of thought policing, the use of the word disinformation in social media. It came up a lot during the Biden administration, and it's probably been used during this current administration. Disinformation as a way of disqualifying someone's thoughts or comments, and also as an excuse for censoring them. People can't hear that. People are not allowed to hear those words because they are disinformation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, if you have a particular example of the usage of this term, I'd love to hear it. But to my mind, what I think about is often, again, I think we're seeing, the operationalization, excuse me, among other things, of this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. People are often discredited for their political arguments, their political beliefs, based on these specious frameworks of things like, for example, they're accused of being state propaganda, or they're accused of being, pro-Hamas or affiliated with Hamas, right? Like that, so that the political demonization of particular organizations ties into how people's expertise is, disqualified a priori, right? so we see this more and more. And then there's this, I think what the Trump administration, Biden did this as well, but I think also what Trump is doing or has done and has consistently refined as a strategy is this interesting way of delegitimizing information. Things are fake news, things are all of this. And so it's refining this idea of disqualifying a source a priori so that you no longer need to engage with the argumentation. And I think this is also systematic of a broader issue of so much of the Israeli atrocity propaganda post October 7th that was normalized within mainstream media, right? This to me is one of the aspects of bipartisan support for the genocide. So we saw, for example, under Biden, how much this was normalized as fact, when in reality later on, these so-called atrocities that had been committed on October 7th, many of them were being listed, were being fabricated, right? Or were being ascribed to Palestinian resistance when they had been committed by the occupation forces. But of course, it had been taken for granted that whatever was said was true. So one of the ways, that people could be accused of being, propagandists for Hamas, being affiliated with Hamas. And of course, we see that all the way to this current moment where the assassination of journalists is linked to an intelligence unit that was recently exposed, whose job was to literally argue convincingly that journalists are linked to Hamas. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking part in resistance, but it's important to note as well that people are being conflated politically as a means of not only delegitimizing them, but legitimizing their assassination, right? When they're practicing a protected and important civic practice, which is telling the truth and exposing crimes of genocide for the world to see. So not sure if that totally encompassed what you were referring to, but those are the things that come to mind regarding this information.
Can I just very quickly, you asked for examples. When I was posting on Facebook, I received this page. It says additional reporting on this. Before you share this content, you might want to know there's additional reporting from Taiwan Fact Check Center. Pages and websites that repeatedly publish or share false news will see their overall distribution reduced and be restricted in other ways. And the source for this Facebook announcement was the Taiwan Fact Check Center. So I think, fact check is also another way of delegitimizing opinions that the establishment doesn't like.
Yes. Let's get the last question from Don.
It's more like a statement. I can't help but notice my uncle was booted, he lost his home and business in Palestine. And I've been hearing about this issue since I was a kid. My mom, who's online right now, can talk about it if she but it's something that I've noticed my whole life is the normalization of genocide. And I just don't understand how we can still be in that spot. I mean, the propaganda, the hate speech, the legal discrimination where laws are written to discriminate against people, the targeting of other groups, of all groups that are not, Zionist, the exaggeration of threats and justifying violence. This is stuff that's been going on for, my whole life. This is what I quoted or looked at is not about Palestine and Israel and what's going on right now. It's just, what I looked up was how Germany in World War II normalized genocide. This is exactly what they did in World War II, and this is exactly what's going on right now. We normalized it to make it easier to deal with. I don't know why media wants to make it easier to deal with, but this is something that's been going on for a very, very long time.
Thank you. Why don't you use that, Omar, for your closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just want to note very quickly that in response to the clarification, I do in fact talk about part of how so-called social media fact checking is a premise that's often used to delegitimize the left in general. And kind of basically justified the increasing censorship and deplatforming of leftist sources under the guise in 2016 of countering, the so-called Russiagate story. So this idea of disinformation being something that the left is primarily penalized for and targeted for and increasingly deplatformed for. So their reach has, massively been shrunk. And of course, what happens to Palestinian expression is also connected to that because, leftist public expression is, of course, concerned with the question of Palestine. So I think that clarified it a little bit. So yeah, I do definitely talk about this. And it's becoming increasingly normalized. But what I would say too is I think that that's right, the sense that what we are seeing is not just the normalization of genocide, but that also we're seeing this take place right now under the ostensible narrative of responding to, the Holocaust during World War II. And in a sense, what we have now is a Holocaust that was committed with full knowledge of that and grotesquely using that as a justification, right? And so what does that say about this genocide that's taking place now, where it's not only that, the lesson that we were supposed to learn from this was not applied, it's that it's being cynically twisted into an alibi to protect the latest manifestation of, colonial racism and dispossession, and say that this colonial racist state project needs to do whatever it wants to do, however it wants to do, however, in all of the insidious ways it wants to practice it because of something that we were supposed to learn from and have this moral takeaway from, right? And so, I mean, the grotesqueness of that, just the moral vacuity of that, I think is really something that needs to continue to animate our outrage, right? And I mean, at times earlier, there were comments about how we feel we're very defeated, and I think that's very real. We're going to have different moments where things hit us and give us low points, but we need to continue to be not just concerned, but outraged with what is happening, and to actually be the ones who bring moral consistency into the systems that lie to us and say they are practicing it. And that's precisely why they engage in the repression that they do. We need to be the example, for others in our spaces and to continue to do what is right by advancing Palestine and legitimizing the righteous efforts of every truth-telling Palestinian who is resisting genocide and colonialism and has done so from the Nakba to now.
Well, Omar Zahzah, thank you so much. His book is Terms of Servitude, published by the Censored Press, which is the doing good work to resist censorship. We're so grateful for your time today, but we're equally grateful for the work you do every day. And as this group knows, this is the moment when I decree that you are a card-carrying member of ICUJP, that your lifetime membership is fully paid up. We hope you will join us in future programs. You'll get our announcements. This is exactly the kind of information that empowers us, that you do not hear on mainstream corporate media, and that's one of the principal reasons ICUJP exists. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca, for the opening reflection. And I know the sense of dread to watch the news that you're feeling. And there's a lot of despair and hopelessness. But the antidote to all of that are times that we spend together in this kind of gathering, and the work that Omar is doing, and the work that each one of you is doing in so many different ways. That is the answer to despair and hopelessness. That's why we provide this safe space every week. Please join us each week. Watch for our activities in the streets and elsewhere, and join us next week. Go in a sense of justice and peace. Do something kind today, something kind for yourself, for your loved ones, and for the wider community. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see each one of you here again next week.